Good afternoon and welcome back to psychopathology. Where you are so far, you've looked at definitions of abnormality, you've started to look at phobias. So a brief introduction, looking at the behavioural, the emotional and the cognitive characteristics, emotional characteristics of phobias. So they are our characteristics that we can pick out. If you were given a scenario, each of them, you practiced that last time. And that's essentially the introduction to each of the mental illness that we're going to look at. So you'll do the same for OCD and the same for depression. So just picking out those key characteristics, just in case you have a question on that. So if you are looking at interleaving and embedding that previous knowledge, which I advise you all to be, I've put up some questions from previous topics for you to have a look at, maybe test yourself or just say them out loud to yourself, or maybe write them down if you didn't get them right, so you know where to spend some of your guided independent time. So who suggested the mind and the body or the brain was separate and independent? Choosing every fourth house on a street is an example of what type of sampling. Once social change has happened, its origins are forgotten by a majority in a process called what? So when you forget it's happened, what's that called? Johnson and Scott, what did they investigate in memory? And then which attachment type is most likely to be associated with bullying? So 5 questions there based on previous topics. You can pause this now and say your answers out loud or whatever. And then here are the answers. So it was Descartes, systematic sampling, social cryptonesia, the weapon focus effect, and insecure avoidance. So if there's anything that you weren't sure of, maybe that's where you could guide some of your independent revision in the next week or so. So I've got a true or false that we looked at last time, but I'll go through those quickly actually because they're relatively straightforward. And get on to where we are now. So we're looking at the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. Now, what's interesting in psychopathology is that each approach is focused on one mental illness. So for phobias, it's behavioural. For depression, it's cognitive. And for OCD, it's biological. Now, for OCD, that's probably the one that students struggle with the most because it's a biological explanation and treatment. So I have set you quite a lot of homework, well, not a lot of homework, 2 essays on OCD in the next coming weeks because I do feel like they are where you're probably going to struggle. Whereas behaviourist approach, you're quite good at understanding, the different types of behavioural approaches that we've looked at, and they're quite, don't want to say easy, but they're quite easy to understand and quite simplistic to understand, I think. It's just some of the key terms that you need to remember here. So we're going to look at this idea of a 2-process model. We're going to have a look at how that explains why somebody has a phobia and other people don't. Evaluate that and then try and apply it to some scenarios to practice that AO2. So first things for you to do then, to discuss with yourself, or if you want to discuss with people in your household and tell them all about it, go for it. What actually is the behaviourist approach? How would we go about defining classical conditioning, that's Pavlov, and operant conditioning, which is Skinner? So our classical conditioning is where we are learning sort of by association. So we are associating in his study with the dogs, they're associating the bell with salivation, they're expecting food. Then operant conditioning is sort of learning by consequence. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So do something good, you're going to get positively praised. Do something bad, you're going to get punished. And then in a phobic sense, it's all about negative reinforcement. So avoiding the situation as much as possible so that you don't get that anxiety, okay? Because you have to remember, phobias are anxiety disorders because they evoke physiological responses, rapid heart rate, pupil dilation. Okay, so these 2 types of conditioning are important for understanding why somebody has a phobia compared to other people. So a question for you to think about is, how might those two conditioning processes be involved in explaining phobias? So thinking about association and about consequence, the only way that we can look at it is via this idea of a two-process model. So Maurer, 1960, looked at classical conditioning, looked at social learning theory as well, and operant conditioning, to explain the onset of phobias. So Maurer said that operant conditioning is used to explain how they are maintained. So why somebody continues to have a phobia is because of those consequences. They're avoiding situations, they're giving it negative reinforcement. Okay, so if you aren't too sure as to what negative reinforcement is, refresh yourself with those key terms. But basically, it's avoidance. You don't want to. So if you have a phobia of a spider, you're going to have negative reinforcement because you're not going to go near it. Therefore, you're allowing it to maintain and continue. When it comes to the acquisition of phobias, so how somebody gets a phobia, it's seen as directly through classical conditioning or indirectly through social learning. So either classical conditioning, you're associating one thing with another, therefore you develop the phobia, or indirectly, so you've learnt that. So let's say vicariously, you've seen a role model have a phobia of something, and then you have indirectly taken that on board. Okay, I mean, I can name it. My mum is absolutely petrified. I won't say it's a phobia, but in this instance it is, of heights. Therefore, because she is quite terrified of it, she's instilled in me to be quite cautious of, going up, really, really high buildings or towers or whatever. And that's something that I've learned indirectly. And it is quite silly, isn't it? But because she's my role model and I'm, brought up by her, it's been instilled in me. Okay, so it's either directly through classical conditioning or indirectly through social learning. Then how they are maintained, how they continue to be prominent, is through operant conditioning. So you're avoiding or escaping a feared object or situation, and that acts as your negative reinforcer. Okay, so those two combined helps us understand why somebody has a phobia. That's basically it, the two-process model. It is quite a simplistic model, which is what you can think about for evaluation. It doesn't take into account any of the cognitive elements, doesn't take into account biological factors. It is quite a basic environmental model of phobias. So, can you think of a way a person might learn abnormal behaviour through operant conditioning? So if we take two here, for example, anorexia and depression, how might people learn abnormal ways of kind of going about their day in terms of these two things through consequence? So learning through consequence. Okay, so you can have a think about that. Then here, now I'm not sure if we've looked at little Albert before. We must have in the behaviourist approach, but I can't remember. It's horrific. But what I've attached on showing my homework is the study of little Albert. It's also in the textbook as well. You would have summarised it and paraphrased, but just have a read through the study, and I've got some questions on the bottom of that sheet for you to answer. What is the study of little Albert? And what we're going to do is look at how Albert was conditioned and use the two-process model to explain that. The pictorial kind of gives it away a little bit. They basically conditioned him to be petrified of small, white, fluffy things. So they gave him a rat and he had absolutely no response. It was a neutral stimulus. Massive loud bang made him cry, and then they had they whacked a hammer over his head on a steel pan and then presented the rat. And over time, the rat became this conditioned stimulus, and the fear response was his conditioned response. Okay, so kind of a little bit like this. So before learning, We had the loud noise, the metal bar, the rat was neutral. The loud noise projected his fear response. But then over time, pairing that loud noise with the white rat meant that the rat became the conditioned stimulus and his fear the conditioned response, okay? So it's an interesting bit of research from the 1920s. Obviously no ethical guidelines whatsoever. Just presented this child, thought, well, you know, instill a phobia in him of white fluffy things. He was actually terrified of Santa Claus as well. Cruel, he's a child. But again, quite a key bit of research that we can use to show the two-process model here. So it's acquired by classical conditioning and maintained by operants and negative reinforcement. So he would avoid anything white and fluffy. They were able to reverse that in him because phobias are manageable, they are treatable with a certain amount of CBT to help develop those irrational and change those rational thought process. So it can happen through counter conditioning, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks' time. But yeah, it is an interesting bit that you can use. Case study though, that's a problem with it. Obviously major ethical issues, you're putting him under a lot of psychological stress. So as well as it being a supportive bit of research, we can also have some of those however statements to really boost it. Okay, so what I have attached on Show My Homework, if you're still struggling a little bit with the evaluation process, I have got like a gap fill sheet that you can have a look at and fill in. I would urge you to have peel paragraphs in your notes rather than just copy from the book, because it does get you practiced in the skill of essay writing. Your question would be something like describe and evaluate an explanation of behavioural explanation of phobias as your question. So trying to constantly, your link sentence, linking it back to that question. That's really important. Really bulking up those AO3. One thing that I'm seeing, they're not dragged out enough. This means that, therefore, however, really try and double whopper it as much as possible. So an example here, the two-process model has good explanatory power. For example, it's explained how behaviours are maintained, phobias are maintained over time. This means it has implications for therapies. It can be used for phobias because it explains why participants need to be exposed to decrease their avoidance behaviour. And then the link. This therefore shows real-life applications and the effectiveness of the two-step process model. Okay, so that's, you know, a nice simplistic peel paragraph. If you were looking to really boost that, you could say something like, it has good explanatory power, however, it doesn't include biological factors or cognitive elements that help us explain phobias. It is based on basically an environmental approach to looking at phobias. It's quite reductionist in that element. So if you're really trying to boost it, the book will help you, but think outside the box. The key with your AA star is looking a little bit further, okay? And it is something that takes time to develop. So once you've had a go at that, well, I'll come back and discuss them, or you can write them as we go through, entirely up to you. So we've got here alternative explanations for avoidance behaviour. So for phobias, we know that avoidance is key. So they choose to actively avoid a situation or avoid a specific phobia so that they do not have that anxiety response. Okay, so it's negative reinforcement. But not all avoidance behaviour is due to reducing anxiety. So things like in our more complex phobias like agoraphobia, so a phobia of going outside, is actually motivated by safety. So not necessarily reducing anxiety, but for a safety element. So one thing that it doesn't do that well is look at every type of phobia. It looks at the two process model is focused on anxiety reduction. So it's saying that it's maintained because of the fear of anxiety. But for some phobias, it's a safety element. So actually, it's lacking a bit of external validity, this theory, because it's not really showing every type of phobia. Okay, so the alternative explanation, excuse me, it's also incomplete. So Bounton looks at the idea of evolution here, so evolutionary factors that have a role in phobias. And the two-process model doesn't include this. So our ancestors would have acquired phobias out of it's for adaptive purposes. So maybe it's a danger thing. So actually it's good to be fearful of snakes, the dark, spiders, because it's actually preparing us or making us safer. So Seligman is quite a key psychologist. He called this biological preparedness. So actually we have an innate predisposition to acquire fear because it protects us, it keeps us safe. It has an evolutionary purpose so that we can pass this on to generations to keep them safe. So there is more than just learning to a phobia. So actually the model lacks internal validity because it's not looking at, again, it's not being that specific. Okay, and then a quick exam question that we might have looked at before, I'm not sure. How could the behavioural approach here be used to explain Kirsty's phobia of balloons? This would probably be a 4-mark answer. One thing I am cautious of is that I don't think we're getting enough practice with application questions. So what I might do is on some of these slides, I'll pop in an AO2 16 marker that you can plan, you can do, because they love them and they are much more prominent than they used to be. So we need to have a bit more practice. So you can have a go at this. I have got a mark scheme, so you can mark it yourself or you can send it to me either way. So Kirsty's in her 20s, had a phobia of balloons since one burst in her face when she was a little girl. Loud noises such as banging and popping cause Kirsty extreme anxiety. She avoids situations like birthday parties and weddings where there might be balloons. Suggest how the behavioural approach might be used to explain Kirsty's phobia of balloons. Okay, so have a look at that. Create an answer if you want to. You can send it to me, or you can have a look at this mark scheme here. So the credit, so it's 4 marks, the credit features of classical and operant conditioning. So you have to have the 2-process model applied. So they've developed through classical conditioning. So she's formed an association between the balloon and the response of fear. Conditioned response is triggered every time she sees a balloon. Her phobia is generalised to different situations. It's maintained because she's avoiding balloons. That's reinforcing it. And then any other features of conditioning you can put in there. So those key terms are quite important as well. Neutral stimulus, condition, response, condition, stimulus. For 4 marks, they do want a lot from you. So you have to be as specific as possible. Another one here, quick multiple choice. I hate multiple choice, but they love them because they're so similar. Which 2 of the following statements apply to the behavioural approach to psychopathology? Unresolved conflicts in childhood affect adult behaviour. All behaviour is learned in the same way. Abnormal behaviour is caused by faulty thinking. The same basic laws that explain animal behaviour can also explain human behaviour. And irrational thoughts lead to abnormal behaviour. So which of the 2 are behavioural approaches to psychopathology? I have got the answers, so pause it, have a think. And that's B and D. So all behaviour is learned the same way, and the same basic laws for animal also explain human. Although they're difficult to generalise, they do test them in the same way. So that's how that links. Okay, and that is the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. So not massively long and extensive. It's all about the 2-process model and then how we can look at positive and negatives of that.